Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah. Today I'm going to continue with our subtopic on the influence of loss of learning on human life. This is actually a life story of Professor Muhammad Mahdi Jenkins, or John Jenkins at the time. I'll relate because he's talking from the first person I. He's saying his I here. It refers to his days when he was with the father of modern behavior psychology, that is Professor B.F. Skinner. So Professor B.F. Skinner has quite a number of very keen students in behavioral psychology, and one of those foremost of his students, which he's mentoring, is John Jenkins. At that time he was a graduate student, and he was also doing a lot of animal research, and he was also applying the laws of learning, and also at a certain point he also developed the Head Start program for people with children with special disabilities and so on under the United States Presidential Office. So this is how he came about to become a well-known psychologist, and how later on he understands the law of learning. It is applied, but what are the flaws and what are the shortcomings? He developed a different model later on in his life, and along the way he also presented this model to B.F. Skinner. Initially B.F. Skinner did not accept his model. This is the model that I'm showing to you which we are using, the Islamic psychology model, which I will show to you again on the cover page of our book. And later on in his life, B.F. Skinner accepted that model, and he knew why the laws of learning is incomplete if we do not have inner speech. So let us read that paragraph here. The influence of the laws of learning on human life. That means referring to John Jenkins at that time when he was doing research with B.F. Skinner, very early realized that the law of learning could have a great influence in human life and a great effect on human society. But it took me a lot longer to truly understand the all-pervasive, powerful and direct nature of those influences. As I have shown, first real understanding came from the studies of animal learning. So they do a lot of animal learning. For example, Prof. John Jenkins, at that time he uses chicken, mice, dogs, monkeys, all kind of animals they used to extrapolate the behavioral aspect of the animal through operant and conditional conditioning and other aspects of stimuli, whether it's reinforcement, punishment, even even the researchers are quite cruel in the sense that they do animal with electrocution, electric impulse and so on, to create phobia, fear and so many other things that is related to the early days of behavioral psychology, which is horrible. From Pavlov to many Skinner and many others later on, you can find that some of those experiments are really cruel, which they should not have done it. They could have just observed it, but then maybe that is the way of science, maybe at that time. The next step, as we have shown, the first real understanding came from the studies of animal learning. The next step in the shaping of my understanding of learning principles involved the simple application of those laws of learning to children with educational difficulties. So they have children with a lot of educational difficulties in terms of dyslexia, ADHD, and so on. I studied many examples of children considered mentally retarded or having learning disabilities. It was with children in those categories that operant learning principles were first widely put into practice. Those were the early effort of the conditions of reinforcement and sometimes punishment, which were set upon, which were of the type that you would have considered artificial, because it was in the early days of understanding this whole idea of loss of learning. They use a lot of approach which are very unnatural. Those organizing the environment so that the specific conditioning could take place has learned their theory and developed their practical skills with animals in the laboratory. It is not surprising that when they use these same learning principles, they were put to practice with human beings, that is, these children, and they were very similar in method as used in the animal research. So they could not contemplate on a higher order of human thinking, that is what we call consciousness. At that time, they just say, okay, your brain, condition your brain, use operant conditioning, use classical conditioning, use laws of learning, apply direct. That's it. That was their understanding. So they discount this whole idea of the nature of consciousness and the nature of inner speech. That is where their fatal flaw is. Those early pioneers in the application of learning principle thought they realized the power of a new tool that they were working with. For a while, they were like modern examples of the knight on white horses, coming to correct the wrongs of the world. So they think, oh, we have found this panacea to all the world's problem. All children's problem can be extrapolated to the chimpanzees, to the monkeys, to the parrots, and whatever it is, and then we can just extrapolate upward and then apply it to human beings just per se. That was their greatest problem. So for a while, they were like modern examples of the knight on white horses coming to correct the wrongs of the world. They believed that they could cure any problem, including any deficiency, and transform human society by the application of the laws of learning. So if by conditioning, applying laws of learning, reinforcement, punishment, whatever approach that works, that's it. On animal, apply it on human being, and you can see success, which is not true anyway. The laws of learning offers a potential beyond even those with the grand claim. That is true to a certain extent. But because of the incomplete knowledge, they didn't even come close. Many of the early believers in the potential of learning principles lost their faith. Most came to consider the early enthusiasm to be misguided and accepted the apparent limitation on the applications of the laws of learning. Some gave up completely and entered other fields. Although all that happened only a relative few years ago, I consider this to be ancient history of behavioral science. So this is ancient history of the science of behavioral psychology, okay, which this man, Professor Mohammed Jenkins, is in the thick of it, together with the Sifu or the Grandmaster P.F. Skinner. As in the early knowledge of most areas of sciences, there are many flaws. Some of those flaws came from a misunderstanding of the available facts. Some of the flaws occurred because the knowledge that was then was not yet available. So this is where, as he developed a lot of animal experiment, he realized that animal has lower consciousness. All of us has consciousness. Even a subatomic particle has consciousness. If you do the double slit experiment, it can be either in a wave form or it can be either in a particle form. All right. If you study Schrödinger double slit experiment, even virus, amoeba, even the lower forms of bacteria has also consciousness. But the level of consciousness is all intrinsic. That means it is not the exercising of free will. So even we go to the highest level of animals, the primates, that means the chimpanzees, the monkeys, the gorillas, they have social interaction. That means they have a higher level of consciousness, but they do not have free will. They work on the level of instinctive, in the sense that they do not have this idea of what is tomorrow. They do not have the idea of what is going to happen to us, and they do not have this consciousness of the understanding of the nature of existence. So that was the fatal flaw. So you cannot extrapolate an animal model to a human model without taking the cue from the model of we having consciousness. And from our consciousness, as I mentioned, from the Islamic principle, it comes from the realm of the spiritual, emotional, mental, and the physical, SEMP. It affects us in terms of our visual, auditory, kinesthetic, the stimuli that is implanted into us. And this inner speech is very important, as in my previous video. So this is the model that Professor Mahdi Jenkins, he was not a Muslim then. He says that we have the input from the environmental factor, the three factor that affects our total past learning history, total past of behavior problem, or the whole life story of any individual or anything. All right. But particularly for animal, we have the environmental inputs. Then we have the intra and intersocial input, because we are a being that is societal. We have families, we have tribes, we have nations, we have humanity, and we have many realities even at a higher level. All right. But controlling all that is our consciousness, which is related to our inner speech. So this is where he presented this model to B.F. Skinner, and for a while B.F. Skinner thought about it and then accepted this, because he says this is the real model for the laws of learning insofar as human being is concerned. So this is where he did a lot of deep research further, and part of this material that you see in this book is part of the research to explain this whole idea of how the laws of learning affect human behavior and how the key component of understanding the intrinsic capability of human being that differentiate us from the animal is we have consciousness, we have inner speech, we have free will. I remember, as I mentioned earlier, absolute free will only come from the absolute dream, that is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The same thing, absolute knowledge comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the all absolute knowledge. He is the all able to do anything and everything. But He gives us in some small measure this attributive aspect of His self, that is His attributes that He gave it to us. So part of the attributes is able to act on things. That means He gave us this capacity, this freedom to act on in this world, this material plane, even though it's not much, even from the perspective of the whole universal principle of this universe. We are not even a speck. We are even just one little atom in the scheme of the physical realm. But within this little earth, teeny weeny puny earth, we have a being that can see far out into the sky. It is not necessary for us to live on this earth. We could have just lived just like chimpanzees or cats or deers, whatever animals that you see, they live and die. But what gives us this intrinsic understanding of the vastness of space? The wanting to know the nature of existence. These are not necessary for a physical existence. So these are the spiritual input that was given to us as our aspect of inner speech. All right, and I have elaborated this many times. You go back to all the more than 170 videos before that. I have given you this whole research that is coming closer and closer to the understanding that our consciousness, our inner speech, come from the realm beyond the material plane, integrated in the material plane as we live on this earth, that we have our input from our roh, our heart, our qalb, our spiritual heart, our akal, all right, our mind, both conscious, subconscious, the akal that is al-akal al-juzi and al-akal al-kuli, and then we have this whole idea of how we can integrate our inner speech towards a positive direction. That will be the finality of the understanding of the laws of learning. This perfection of understanding that part of behavioral psychology from the animal model extrapolated into the human model, but taking cognizance of the nature of our consciousness, the nature of our inner speech, and we have a beautiful model, inshallah, that would be perfect. And that is the path of the understanding of the nature of Islamic psychology, especially positive Islamic psychology. We are talking about positive Islamic psychology, but the same model applies to Islamic psychology. This is our hope, and we appreciate if you are a student in psychology or you are doing your master's, your PhD, get your friends to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Islamic Psychology PIP, and then you do your research, you do your master's, you do your PhD, and do more of this kind of understanding to bring forward this beautiful deen of Islam. And it took a man who converted to Islam some 30 years ago to spend all his life devoted to developing the Khalifa method, and later on, before he passed on the manuscript on this book of Positive Islamic Psychology, a transcendent model to achieve peace, happiness and success in the 21st century, to bring the Ummah to be the highest of the people on this 21st century civilization, the best of the best, to become achievers, to realize the grandeur and the glory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be His true and sincere servant, to be His Khalifa, always striving to make ourselves good, helping others to be good, and making the world good, inshallah.